Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Michelle and today I wanted to go through an end of the year wrap up. So what I decided for this video would just be to go through, I think I have 12 or 13 books that I read this year that really kind of stood out to me. And so as much as I can, I'm going to put them in the order that I read them, and so hopefully they fall in each month. That doesn't matter, but we can pretend that I read them for each month of the year. I think I definitely read more towards the end of this year than the beginning of this year, but that's fine. We're gonna go through it. So let's get into it. The very first book that I read this year was The Vanishing Half. So I found out about this book through my library website as a recommended book, and I didn't know about BookTube at the time. So I looked on Amazon and read the reviews, and most of them were pretty positive. So I checked it out. And basically it's about these two twins who live in this really small rural community. They're both Black, but they look as though they could be white. And the girls are about 16. They decide to run away to the big city, and they're living there for a couple months. And one of the twins is trying to find a job. When she marked colored on the application, she wasn't given a second look. She went into the next interview, marked white, and was given the job. So from that point on, she decided she was going to live her life as a white female. The other twin did not choose to do that, and she embraced her Black heritage. So they kind of go in opposite directions, and so it follows the trajectory of their lives, and then it follows the daughters' lives and kind of just shows how the decisions of their mothers affected the decisions of their daughters. So it was interesting, and I would recommend it. The next book that I read that stood out to me for February was Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This book that I read was basically a contemporary African-American woman named Dana who lived with her husband, Kevin, who was white. And it was set in, I think it was published in like 79. So it was contemporary for its time. And so she and her husband, they're eating dinner, and all of a sudden she gets transported back in time. And she ends up on the bank of this river. She sees a little boy who's drowning. She goes in, saves him, does CPR, and he's revived. And very quickly she realizes that she's on a plantation, and this little white boy is named Rufus. Over the course of some time, Dana keeps going back in time to this plantation, and she realizes that like her family are enslaved on this plantation. Every time she gets pulled back, she realizes that it's in some way connected to Rufus, whether he's like in pain or peril or not in a great situation. So she's trying to help him, but also make sure she doesn't interfere with like history, because it could directly affect her and her family because she is descended from them. So she doesn't want to jeopardize her own existence. So it was pretty interesting, but I definitely recommend it. I did enjoy it quite a bit. This next book that I read was called Know My Name by Chanel Miller. And if you remember this, or if you're familiar with the case, the book centers around the Stanford rape case. Chanel is the victim and decided not to be anonymous anymore and released this book to shed the victim label, but she explains everything that happened leading up to the events of that night, what happened during that time, and then how she's progressed ever since then. And so it is really well written. Obviously, it could be a trigger if that's something that you're really sensitive to, but I would recommend you listen to the audiobook, which I try to do that anytime there's an audiobook that is done by the author. If it's a memoir especially, I do try to listen to the audiobook if I can. Before she decided not to be anonymous any longer, she did write a victim impact statement during the trial. That was released and it went viral. It was really cool to hear her story, and obviously it's hard to hear the things that she went through, but it was really well done, and I just feel like it's really brave of her to go out there and share a story like that. And I follow her on Instagram now, so it's cool to see how she's used that to propel herself forward. Okay, this next book is called The Silk Roads: A New History of the World by Peter Frankopan. So I borrowed this book from my uncle, and it's like it's thick. It really does span like a good chunk of the history of our world, but it is all based in the East, and it has the whole perspective of the Eastern world and how that's impacted other parts of the world as it has gone through different eras in history. So it was really interesting. And it also shows how even with the rise of like Western superpowers, how they're still looking towards the East for certain resources, for power plays and all of this. And so I really enjoyed it. I read it initially. I read a good chunk of it in the physical copy, but then I also read it on my ebook because I started traveling and I was like, I'm not going to carry this like 5-pound book with me. And then I also listened to it on audiobook, which helped tremendously with like some of the pacing, because for me it was fascinating because I love history, but it is a hefty book. So it's 662 pages, and that is the longest book I've read. It took me months to get through because I would just read a little bit and then I would set it down for like a couple of months and then I would pick it up again and then I started to finish it. But it took me the better part of like 6 months, start to finish, including my pauses, to finish it. But if that is something that you think would tickle your fancy, maybe you should check it out. So the next book that I read was called The Song of Achilles. And yes, I had discovered BookTube. So this was like sometime in the summer when I went ahead and read it. I got the ebook through my library and I read it and I enjoyed it. And for me, it hadn't been like overhyped, so I was able to like enjoy it enough to where it wasn't like ruined for me. So it definitely does tear your heart out a little bit at the end there. And even with some of the minor characters, you want the best for them, you're attached. But I did enjoy it, so I'm just adding to the chorus of everyone else who loved it. This next book was also a BookTube recommendation after Song of Achilles, and I read Normal People by Sally Rooney. This book follows Connell and Marianne, and they were like acquaintances, and eventually they kind of became friends to lovers, and then it shows their relationship, which I'm not really into like romance books, and I wouldn't say this was exactly that. It just kind of like describes their lives and their time together and apart, and they really are kind of an on again, off again couple, and it shows you like the events in their lives that are kind of leading up to each of those decisions, whatever they get back together or they kind of break up, and it's not even clear if they've like fully broken up sometimes. And you know, they say communication is key. It is key. If these people had come together and just sat down, had a full conversation and just said, hey, this is how I feel, this is what I want, this is what I need, they could have avoided all of the on again, off again. But that's life. You know, we as humans don't always communicate well with each other and things happen. So I appreciated the realistic aspect of that, because I just feel like the majority of romance books are they're just full of tropes. It's like one of 3 different tropes happen and you kind of already know how it's going to end. But this one actually kind of leaves you on a bit of a cliffhanger. You're not quite sure how it's going to end. You have an educated guess based on like the decisions that have been made up to that point. But I appreciated the realism of it. When spooky season happened this year, I read Frankenstein. So this book had been sitting on my shelf for years. It actually was my sister's copy that she read in high school, and I decided to kind of absorb it into my library, and this year I finally read it. And let me tell you, this is nothing like what pop culture would have you believe. Like, I think when I think of Frankenstein before reading this, I would think of like a green monster who's just making unintelligible noises and has bolts in his neck and is just terrorizing people. And okay, that's just not the book. So in this book, there's Dr. Frankenstein. He's going to med school, and then as his side project, I guess, he figured out how to reanimate corpses. So he pulled together all these different parts of corpses, sews them together to make this huge monster who's hideous and over 8 feet tall, and he reanimates it. So then this monster is just like, oh my gosh, like what, I'm here. And then the doctor is like, oh my gosh, I did this. Oh my gosh. It's just, it ends up being really tragic because the monster, he just wants to be loved, and he realized that his creator is afraid of him, so he runs away, and he actually observes this adorable little family of this brother, sister, and their older father who's blind. And then the brother marries this woman who comes into their home. So the monster first learns French through observing them, and then the son teaches his wife English. So the monster learns English. So he's bilingual, but he's in hiding because he realizes that people don't react so kindly to him. Some tragic events start to unfold within the life of the doctor. And then you realize they're all kind of intertwined. So it's just sad. You know, I mean, the doctor regrets making the monster, but he doesn't actually teach it to be civilized or anything or make it prettier. And then the monster just wants to be loved, wants a wife that's also a monster so they can run away and live, I think, in like South America. And it's just, it's interesting. But I didn't know the monster could talk. Like, I had no idea based off popular culture, but it was good. I can understand how it has stood the test of time. If this is maybe your first foray into reading classics, maybe do the audiobook because I think that might help with the pacing, but I definitely recommend this. The next book that I read for spooky season was called The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. And I don't really read horror books. I don't watch scary movies. Like, that's just not my genre. But I saw it on a few people's recommendation list and I checked it out at the library. And basically it follows these 4 young men who are part of the Blackfeet Nation. They are hunting one day on their reservation. They're all between like 15, 16 years old when this happens. And they go hunting past where they're supposed to go in this area that was reserved for the elders of their tribe. Some things go wrong, and about 15 years later, it seems like all of a sudden they're being hunted one by one. There is like a supernatural entity that is made itself known. And so as you're reading the book, you kind of figure out what's happening, what kind of triggered this, and like who's gonna make it out alive. Here I would issue a trigger warning. When people start dying, they start dying in spectacularly gruesome ways. So if that's not really your cup of tea, I don't recommend this book. But if you are all for that, then you might love this book. So I'm a little on the fence. Like, it was good, and I did appreciate the commentary throughout the book of what it's like to be a Native American at this moment in time in American history, whether you're living on the reservation or you're not, how you're perceived by other people. And it was creative, but I don't know if I'm like into horror enough to like be the best critic of the book. So I'll just leave that open to you. Another book that I read that I really loved, and honestly is probably one of the best books that I feel like I read in the last 2 months. It was called Ready Player One. This book is about America in the future. I think it's like 2040 or something like that. And there's like this massive global warming crisis where everyone's kind of moved to the cities and everyone's just kind of doing what they can to survive. In the midst of this setting, there is this worldwide phenomenon, this popular game called The Oasis. And basically it's a virtual reality game where you can just sit wherever you are, you put your visor on, and you're in this new world. You can create your own avatar, you can go to work in the Oasis, you can go to school in the Oasis, and just kind of live this full life inside of the Oasis. So most people are doing that at this point. The creator of the Oasis dies. He decided in his will that whoever could find this egg and the key, that he or she would be the person to inherit his billions and to have full control over the oasis to use however they desire. Everybody is looking for this within the 5 years that have passed since this man's death. And I really loved it. It was such a vivid description of the world, and you see like this group of teens kind of come together, and it was kind of like a bit of an epic journey, but it was grounded in reality enough that you're like, oh yeah, I could kind of see that being an actual possibility. So I thought it was fun. I also read this book called Honey Girl. That's by Morgan Rogers, and I believe it was her debut novel. So in it, there is this young African-American girl who wakes up in Vegas with a ring on. So she wakes up married to a complete stranger, has no idea what happened really. And so throughout the course of the book, you're kind of going back and forth between like her present life, how she's like, okay, well, I'm gonna just move on and maybe I can find this woman that's now my wife. And also you see the events that led up to her getting to this trip in Vegas. So she had just finished her PhD in astronomy. She's trying to find a job and just really start her career. However, her mentor doesn't quite understand everything that she's up against, because while her mentor is a female and understands that side of it, her mentor doesn't understand what it's like to be female and queer and Black. And you can just see her having to deal with all of these microaggressions and other things that she may not otherwise have to have come up against. So for example, when she published her PhD, some of the people who are potentially on the hiring board for her think that she might have made up some of her work that she worked really hard for, because they didn't believe that someone who was Black could have done that work. So things like that come up. And then under all of this, she's like trying to make sure that her parents are proud of her, trying to find out who she is. And then she's also trying to figure out if she wants to find this person or if they're gonna like get annulled or divorced or stay married. So I wouldn't say it's like a coming of age. It's really more of like a quarter life crisis, but it's really cool to kind of see how she makes her way through all of that and find who she is and embrace the things that make her who she is. One of the last books that I read was The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. And this is a book that I've been meaning to read for years. I watched the movie a long time ago, but I'd meant to read the book beforehand and I just never did. So this is a book about two kids who meet each other in a cancer kids support group. And it follows Hazel, who is our main protagonist, and she meets this boy called Augustus Waters. And so it follows them on this journey while they get to know each other and they fall in love, but it also surrounds topic of obviously of cancer, because it's one of the things that others have come to define them with, but they're just trying to live their life as normal as possible. It's cool to kind of see how they get to know each other and support each other and how they're dealing with being kids who have cancer and still making the best of their lives. So this last book that I read, I just finished it, was called Heartless by Marissa Meyer. I was intrigued to read it because I had heard that it was like a fairy tale retelling of the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. So basically it follows this girl named Kath who lives in the land of hearts, and it just shows you the things that happen in her life to lead her closer and closer to becoming this villain that we all know and maybe love. I don't know. She says off with her head, like that's what I knew about her from like the movie, but it was really good. I love a good origin story. I like things that tell you kind of like, it doesn't excuse people's behavior, but you at least understand a little bit more how they got to be where they're at now. So I did love that, to see like what did happen to her. This reimagining of it tells you how she became the queen, how she became that person who hates people, and even why she hates white roses. Like I thought the detail was great, the pacing was good, and I found it to be really enjoyable. So those are books that I read this year that really kind of stood out to me. Of all the books that I read, Oh, bonus story. I did read House in the Cerulean Sea. You can check any other booktuber. I know they probably read that, so I won't get into it, but it really was heartwarming. And I also think that's one that kind of lived up to the hype. It was really sweet, and I think you'll love it if you haven't read it. Now I'm done. So those are all the books that I read that really stood out to me this year. And I hope that you guys have a wonderful holiday season, and I'll see you next year. Bye.